For decades, the Florida Everglades was disappearing in plain sight, not burning, not flooding, just going quiet. The birds stopped nesting in the numbers they used to. The deer trails faded. The small mammals that had threaded through the sawgrass for thousands of years simply stopped showing up. Scientists knew something was wrong, but the scale of it didn't land until they started counting. When researchers fitted radio transmitters to marsh rabbits and released them into python territory, every single one was dead within a month. Not most of them, all of them. I'm Tom Marsh, and this is the story of how a team of ecologists decided to fight one of the worst biological invasions in American history, not with poison, not with traps, not with hired hunters working the levees at night, but with robots. And what those robots found hiding inside the collapse of an entire food web was something that changed how we understand what it even means to lose a species from a place. The Everglades covers roughly 1.5 million acres of southern Florida. It is not a swamp in the way most people picture a swamp. It moves. A slow, shallow sheet of water, sometimes just inches deep and miles wide, drifting south from Lake Okeechobee toward Florida Bay. The Calusa people called it Pahayoki, grassy water. It sustained panthers, wood storks, alligators, hundreds of species of wading birds, and a dense interlocking community of small mammals that formed the base of almost every food chain worth naming in that ecosystem. Then, at some point in the 1980s, Burmese pythons arrived. The best current evidence points to the pet trade animals released deliberately or accidentally, probably near the boundaries of the park itself. The first confirmed wild python in Everglades National Park was documented in 1979. By the 1990s, the population was established. By the 2000s, it had already reached a scale that made the word invasion feel inadequate. Burmese pythons are ambush predators. They don't chase, they don't signal their presence. They wait, motionless, body temperature matching the ambient air, and they strike with a speed that sensor equipment still struggles to fully resolve. In the sawgrass prairie and dense hardwood hammocks of the Everglades, they are nearly invisible. A fully grown female can exceed 18 feet in length and weigh more than 200 pounds. She can go months without eating, and she produces clutches of up to 100 eggs at a time. The mammals didn't have a behavioral library for this. The raccoons, the opossums, the rabbits, none of them had evolved alongside a sit-and-wait ambush predator at that scale. In North America's fossil record, nothing quite like this existed in the recent ecological past. So when the pythons spread, the mammals had no instinct to pull from. No alarm call shaped for this. No flight distance calibrated for a predator that gave no warning. A study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2012 quantified what that looked like on the ground. Researchers compared mammal survey data from before and after python establishment across road transects inside and outside the park. The results were striking enough that they set off alarm bells far beyond the wildlife management community. Raccoon observations had declined by more than 95% within the python-invaded core. Opossum sightings had dropped by 98%. Marsh rabbits were effectively gone. Bobcats were down by over 80%. The numbers read like a mass extinction event, but compressed into a matter of years rather than millennia. The food web didn't just lose prey species, it began losing the predators that depended on those prey species. Red-shouldered hawks, great horned owls. The Florida panther, already one of the most endangered large mammals in North America, was being squeezed from below. When the rabbit disappears, the hawk has to work harder. When the hawk has to work harder, its territory expands and its reproductive success drops. When the panther finds fewer deer, fewer rabbits, fewer raccoons at the water's edge, it moves differently, risks more, and survives less reliably. But all of this was documented at a remove. Scientists could measure the absence. What they couldn't do was watch the mechanism in real time. They couldn't see the pythons actually taking the mammals, because pythons are extraordinarily difficult to observe and even harder to track in dense subtropical vegetation. The snakes were essentially invisible actors in a crime scene where researchers kept arriving after the fact. That's where the robot rabbits came in. The idea sounds like a thought experiment until you see the engineering behind it. In a project centered at South Florida natural areas, researchers and wildlife engineers developed what they called prey-mimicking biorobots. These were not toys. They were chassis of electromechanical components wrapped in preserved rabbit fur, real rabbit fur treated and prepared so that the thermal signature and scent profile mimicked a living animal as closely as possible. The robots could be programmed to move in patterns consistent with rabbit behavior, pausing, shifting direction, the occasional burst of speed followed by stillness, and they were embedded with sensors, accelerometers, pressure gauges, cameras, a full suite of hardware designed to capture, from inside a strike event, what actually happened when a python hit. The goal was to gather the encounter data that live animal telemetry could only gesture toward. Scientists had long known that fitting radio collars to marsh rabbits in python territory produced data that terminated quickly, the signal going still, then being located inside or near a python, but the collar couldn't tell you the approach, the timing, the behavioral sequence that preceded the strike. The robot could. The implications for management were obvious. If you understood exactly how pythons were locating and selecting prey, whether by thermal cue, by movement pattern, by scent, you could design interventions more precisely. Traps calibrated to the actual sensory triggers, repellents built around what the snake was actually responding to, lures that worked with the biology rather than against it. But the robots delivered something that wasn't on the expectation list. When the teams deployed the biorobots in areas of confirmed high python density zones, where the mammal surveys showed near total collapse, they found python activity exactly as expected. Strike attempts were recorded, the sensors did their job, that data was valuable. What it confirmed about python hunting behavior was consistent with what had been theorized. The animals were using a combination of infrared-sensitive pit organs and chemical cues from the Jacobson's organ, integrating thermal and olfactory information in a way that made the sawgrass prairie, for a Burmese python, functionally transparent. But in the process of moving through those areas, the teams began picking up something else on their cameras and movement logs, animals that the mammal surveys had written off as locally extinct, marsh rabbits, living ones, not many, not recovering in any sense that would suggest the crisis was over, but present. Moving through corridors that the broad survey data had, this required explanation, and the explanation, when it came, was not what the management agencies had been hoping for. The surviving marsh rabbits weren't distributed randomly. They were clustered in microhabitats, specific vegetation structures within the broader sawgrass matrix that appeared to limit python access. Dense stands of mooly grass, elevated spoil islands left over from old drainage canal construction, pockets of landscape that a large ambush predator couldn't easily use without compromising its own effectiveness. The rabbits weren't winning some behavioral arms race. They weren't learning to detect pythons. They were, in effect, accidentally refuge-seeking, concentrating in the few places where the geometry of the habitat worked in their favor rather than the pythons. Here's where this stops being a story about robots and starts being a story about what a species can hold on to across the edge of local extinction. The marsh rabbit, Silvolagus palustris, has been in the Everglades for a long time, a very long time. It co-evolved with alligators, with cottonmouths, with panthers, with red-tailed hawks. Its escape behaviors, its use of dense vegetation, its preference for water margins, all of it was shaped by a long roster of native predators. None of those predators hunted the way a Burmese python hunts. And yet some of what those older predators had selected for the tendency to move through dense cover, to stay close to water, to break into tight vegetation at the first sign of disturbance, was apparently creating marginal survival in python-dense terrain, not because it was designed for pythons, but because it happened to make the rabbits harder to strike in the ambush geometry that pythons depend on. The behavior was ancient, the predator was new. and the ancient behavior was just barely enough. This is a paper-thin margin. Researchers who examined the distribution data were careful not to overstate it. A small residual population hiding in landscape pockets is not a population on its way back. It is a population, one bad drought, one major python push, one habitat disturbance away from disappearing entirely. But the fact that it existed at all said something important about the resilience that survives inside a species even when the numbers fall to levels that look like extinction from the outside. A follow-up assessment drawing on over 2 decades of monitoring data in the Everglades system found that the species most likely to retain any measurable presence in heavily invaded zones were those whose pre-invasion behavioral repertoire included some trait, almost any trait, that happened to create spatial separation from optimal python ambush sites. It wasn't learning, it wasn't adaptation in any evolutionary sense. It was the latent consequence of every selection pressure that had ever shaped these animals, suddenly mattering in a completely different context. The management picture is still grim. There is no clean solution to the python problem in South Florida. Hunting programs, including incentive-based removal competitions organized by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, have removed tens of thousands of pythons from the system over the past decade. Detector dog programs, thermal aerial surveys, the development of pheromone-based trapping, all of it has made progress. Python detecting canine teams trained to locate snakes by scent alone have shown real effectiveness in some habitats. A male lure program, in which surgically implanted tracker pythons nicknamed Judas snakes lead researchers to aggregations of snakes during breeding season, has resulted in meaningful removals in some test corridors, but the rate of removal has not yet matched the rate of reproduction. The population remains enormous. The mammal communities inside the park remain suppressed. In the landscape, all 1.5 million acres of it is simply too large and too dense for any top-down removal program to clear, which means the most important management tool available is the one that costs nothing but political will, protecting the habitat refuges where the remnant populations are holding on, the dense muley grass stands, the spoil islands, the transition zones between open water and thick cover where small mammals can persist in the geometry that slightly disadvantages a large ambush predator. These are not glamorous interventions. They don't make headlines the way removal competitions do, but they are the difference between a population that hangs on long enough for better tools to arrive and one that doesn't. There is a name for this approach in the conservation literature: refugia management. The concept predates the python crisis by decades. It was developed in the context of glacial refugia, the small, climatically stable pockets where species survived ice ages and from which they recolonized larger ranges when conditions improved. The logic is the same. You don't need to hold the whole range. You need to hold enough of the right pockets in the right condition for long enough. If the broader crisis is eventually reduced, if the python population is ever brought below the threshold where it saturates every habitat type, the animals hiding in those pockets are the seed population for anything that recovers. The word Everglades itself is a corruption of an older term, Everglades, the English approximation of the endless, open, grassy space that early European observers struggled to name. The Calusa, the Miccosukee, the Seminole people who lived in and around this system for centuries knew what to call it: Pahayoki, grassy water. A name that described not a boundary or a landmark, but a quality, the feel of the place, the specific texture of water moving slowly through grass. The marsh rabbit was part of what made that word make sense. A name for a place includes, implicitly, a name for everything that made the place what it was. When the rabbits disappear, something about the word loses its referent. Not in a metaphorical sense, in a functional one. The hawks that fed on the rabbits fed on the productivity of the grassy water. The panthers that moved through the hammocks were counting on a food web that started in the sawgrass with small mammals. The name described a system, and the system included every animal the name implied. The robot rabbits didn't save the Everglades. No single tool is going to do that. But they found something that no standard survey method had found, that the system hadn't fully let go yet, that somewhere in the deep logic of what a marsh rabbit is and the behavioral inheritance of every predator that ever shaped it, there were instructions for surviving at the edge of something it had never encountered before. Not perfectly, not safely, but just enough. That is not a comfortable story. It doesn't end with the numbers turning around or the hawks coming back or the pythons being brought to heel. But it is a true one, and in this landscape, right now, the true story is the one that matters. Because the question facing managers, policymakers, and the communities that live alongside the Everglades isn't whether this ecosystem is worth saving. That argument is settled. The question is whether we are willing to do the slow, unglamorous, politically difficult work that refugium management requires. Whether we protect the mully grass stand that doesn't look like much from a car window but is holding the last marsh rabbits in a 10-kilometer stretch of invaded habitat. Whether we fund the removal programs long enough for the cumulative pressure to mean something. Whether we give this system the one thing it cannot generate for itself, time. The Everglades has been here for roughly 5,000 years in its current form. The pythons arrived 40 years ago. The math isn't settled yet. What you think about that, about whether we owe these systems the patience they need, about whether rewilding and invasive species management can coexist in a place this compromised, that's the conversation I want to have. Leave it in the comments, because I read them, and this is exactly the kind of question that doesn't have a clean answer but deserves a real one. If this story hit you the way it hit me when I first went deep on the research, share it with someone who thinks the Everglades is just a place you fly over on the way to Miami. There are more stories like this one, of ecosystems balanced on edges most people never hear about, of remnant populations holding on in ways that shouldn't work but somehow do. There are more of them than you'd imagine, and I have many more to tell. I'm Tom Marsh. Thank you for watching.